God had just led them out of Egypt by obliterating the most powerful army on the face of the earth, by splitting the Red Sea in two, by leading them through the desert, feeding them and watering them all the time, taking care of their needs, leading them gently. And now Moses has gone up the mountain to converse directly with God, leaving the people feeling abandoned, alone, worried, stranded in the desert. So they want a sign, a reminder of God's powerful protection. So they make a golden calf, the strong animal, a sign of God's power. The gold taken from the Egyptians, a sign of God's grace and generosity. And for a while, that suffices. But they become frightened and impatient. In their fear, in their desire for security, for guidance, they substitute the sign of God for God himself. And the golden calf becomes God, and they begin worshiping it and sacrificing to it, identifying that thing as the God who brought them out of Egypt. Despite all God had done, despite God's powerful displays of faithfulness and trustworthiness, they turn and worship a golden calf, inert. They replace the living and powerful God with a statue that comforts them, appeases them, makes them feel safe. But for all of that, their idolatry actually separates them from God. They abandon God for their own ways, putting their faith and their trust not in God, but in the works of their own hands. They wanted a God made in their image, to freeze an image of the real God with the God that they had wanted, a God who accepts their sacrifices and gives them what they desire. Now, I don't think any of you have a golden calf set up in your basement, although I am a little worried about Ron over here. But we do worship idols, each and every one of us, placing our trust in what we do, what we have, what we earn, where we live. Perhaps we create an image of God that draws together only the parts of God that we like. Or perhaps we substitute, misunderstand, or misuse the rules, religion, and the church, exchanging them and their comfortable routine for the God who created them, and indeed everything, including us, created them to draw others to himself. In any of these ways, in all of these ways, we push God aside. We make idols the center of our lives, putting our trust in the blessings God has given us rather than in the God who gave them, ultimately making ourselves the center, the controller of our own lives, becoming in the process a little self-righteous and judgmental, according to our own criteria rather than in God's. We say to God what my little nephew, who is no longer so little and is now looking at colleges, used to say, "You ain't the boss of me, Uncle Robbie." And today, Jesus tells 3 stories to crack that idolatry of the scribes and the Pharisees summed up in their self-righteous rejection of those Jesus chose. Why are you eating with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus answers by telling 3 stories about loss. Tales of 3 losers who were not content to live with that loss. A shepherd, a woman, and a father. Now, all shepherds were questionable, considered unclean by the law, and this one also considered a fool for leaving the 99 to go in search of the one. And worse, rather than scolding the sheep, he places the sheep on his shoulders and brings it home, rejoicing as he makes his way back and celebrating a party upon arrival. The woman searches intently for her lost coin, even lighting a lamp, using up precious oil to search. And when she finds that coin, she throws a party, spending lavishly far beyond the value of the coin. And then there's the forgiving father. The younger son demands his share of the inheritance, the equivalent of wishing his father dead, and goes off to squander it on idols of wealth, and, to put it kindly, a life of dissipation. The older brother has stayed home, continued working, but is equally distant from the father, his hardened heart, and the idolatry of his own efforts keeping him away. The father waits for the younger son to come to his senses, leaving him free to live with his choice. But when the son returns, even with questionable motives, the father sees his son while still a long way off. The father has been waiting patiently for the boy, scanning the horizon each and every day, waiting for his beloved son. Throwing caution and his dignity to the winds, the father rushes out to meet his son, wrapping the boy not in the dignity merely of a hired worker, but wrapping the boy in his own dignity as a beloved son, as real as the robe on his shoulders now, the sandals on his feet, and the ring on his finger. And then the party begins. And this is where we see just how far the older brother has grown, refusing to go inside, staying outside, skulking and sulking because he feels slighted, refusing the father's kindness, insulting his father greatly, an act deserving of the father's anger, no less than the younger son. But here, as with the younger son, the father makes the first move and goes out to his older son, answering grievance with generosity. Everything I have is yours. And begging his son to enter into the joy of his heart. Jesus tells these three stories to explain why he eats with sinners and tax collectors, describing who God is and how God works. For Jesus, the defining element of who the Father is mercy. And we can see these three parables as a catalog of how we get separated from God, how we get lost, and how God waits and welcomes us back. Sometimes we wander off like sheep, discontented with the grazing ground around us, and then we can't find the way back. Perhaps we find ourselves in the dark, wandering lost, because whoever or whatever we thought the light of our life has gone dim, leaving us in the dark. Perhaps we deliberately get lost, separating ourselves from where we are to seek adventure, freedom, or more than we had at home, leaving us in a foreign place. Or perhaps we stay right where we are, but get lost in our own world and our own works, losing sight of God's generosity, reducing God's blessings to the work of our own hands, hardening our hearts to God, to others, and even to ourselves. But we are not made to stay lost. It's why God sent his only Son, the Hound of Heaven, as the poet Francis Thompson calls Jesus, relentlessly tracking us down. God waits for us. God searches for us. And God runs out to meet us, even while we are still a long way off, inviting us into the party, gently reminding us that calves are for eating, not adoration.